Detente to disarray, the breakdown of the bipolar world, 1969 to 1981. The nuclear balance of power. The Soviet Union attained rough parity with the United States during the 1970s. Both possessed huge nuclear arsenals that gave each the capacity to obliterate the other, even after enduring first strike. This situation, called mutually assured destruction or MAD, actually provided the possibility for new agreements. Detente. It is the easing of hostility or strained relations, especially between countries. Talks soon began after Richard Nixon became president in 1969 and proceeded against a backdrop of easing tensions or detente. Detente, while largely driven by the bilateral interests of the United States and Soviet Union, also included calculations of other powers. West Germany. Willy Brandt, Chancellor of West Germany, began his Ostpolitik, literally a politics of the East, in the late 1960s, and negotiated agreements with the Soviet Union, Poland, and East Germany. SALT I was an agreement between the United States and the Soviet Union in 1971 that did not reduce stockpiles but only imposed constraints on future arms increases. Perhaps most important, both sides agreed not to build full-scale anti-ballistic missiles, ABM systems. There was going to be another treaty, SALT II, but in December 1979, the Soviets launched an invasion of Afghanistan. The Soviet attack effectively killed any chance of SALT II being passed, and Carter endured this by withdrawing the treaty from the Senate in January 1980. The Helsinki Accords. This was an agreement that recognized the inviolability of the post-World War II frontiers in Europe and pledged the 35 signatory nations to respect human rights and fundamental freedoms, and to cooperate in economic, scientific, humanitarian, and other areas. The superpowers and regional conflict. There was civil war in Angola between Ethiopia and Somalia. War in Angola began in 1974 when Portugal abruptly dissolved its African empire. The Progressive Movement for the Liberation of Angola, MPLA, occupied the capital and had the backing of the Soviet Union. Other factions took what aid they could get from China, South Africa, the United States, and Zaire. By the end of 1976, the MPLA controlled most of Angola. The Marxist leadership of Angola proved to be quite interested in American investment. Angola also sent home the Cuban troops that had helped it win power and eventually distanced itself from the Soviet Union. Ethiopia and its subsequent war with Somalia. A drought and famine in 1973 led to a military coup in Ethiopia. Mengistu Haile Mariam consolidated power in a Marxist dictatorship. In July 1977, hoping to take advantage of unrest in Ethiopia, Somalia invaded the Ethiopian province of Ogaden. Despite its previous support for Somalia, the Soviet Union decided to back Ethiopia. The United States transferred arms to Somalia from friendly Arab nations. Neither superpower was very pleased with its new ally, and none of the parties involved got much benefit from the conflict. India and Pakistan. War between Pakistan and India in 1971 drew the attention of the superpowers, but it was fueled mostly by traditional motives such as territorial ambitions and religious and ethnic hatreds. Pakistan was then divided between West and East Pakistan. India separated the two by nearly 1,000 miles of its territory. Yom Kippur War, 1973. One factor in the instability of the region was the unresolved problem of Palestinian refugees. Many refugees joined the political organizations, the largest of which was Yasser Arafat's Palestinian Liberation Organization, or PLO. The 1967 war between Israel and its neighbors had actually made a definitive settlement of difference more difficult. Yom Kippur. On October 6, 1973, hoping to win back territory lost to Israel during the Third Arab-Israeli War, Egyptian and Syrian forces launched a coordinated attack against Israel on Yom Kippur, a holy day. Israel counterattacked and recaptured the Golan Heights. Israel's early victory in its new enlarged territory bred complacency with the status quo. For the Arabs, defeat fed old animosities and made negotiations seem a form of surrender. By 1973, Egypt and Syria had gained the advantage over Israel, not only in numbers of troops but also in tanks and aircraft. A carefully planned attack was launched on October 6, 1973, on Yom Kippur, a holy day in the Jewish calendar. Israel, at first forced back from its border, gained the initiative within a week. Within 2 weeks, it was poised to strike against Cairo and Damascus, capitals of Egypt and Syria, respectively. Syria and Egypt had to agree to a truce. Israel no longer felt invulnerable. Egypt and Syria no longer felt powerless, and the war moved the Middle East to the top of the diplomatic agenda of the United States. The Yom Kippur War had serious economic consequences for the United States. Arab producers of oil imposed a boycott on the sale of oil to the United States and other nations that supported Israel. It was now more than ever in American interest to bring Israel and its neighbors to a settlement. Middle East peace talks. Building on a series of agreements that disengaged the combats and Anwar Sadat's visit to Arab or Israeli-occupied Jerusalem, Egypt and Israel signed a treaty in 1979 that restored the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt in exchange for Egyptian recognition of Israel. The treaty met the needs of Israel, Egypt, and the United States. The peace talks were held at Camp David and known as the Camp David Accord. The agreements between Israel and Egypt were signed on September 17, 1978, that led to the following year to a peace treaty between those two states, the first such treaty between Israel and any of its Arab neighbors. And this was initiated by President Jimmy Carter. Oil embargo and economic change. Economic realignments. The United States no longer enjoyed unchallenged supremacy in industry, banking, and agriculture by the 1970s. Western Europe had attained parity in trade and production, though not as yet in personal income or technological innovation. The Japanese economy had expanded even more dramatically. The economics and politics of petroleum. In terms of transportation and other aspects of modern industry, oil had become central to the modern economy. The oil embargo would have a sizable effect on prices. The price of oil quadrupled from under $3 a barrel at the start of the year to nearly $12 at the end. Even after the end of the boycott, prices remained high. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, now used its control of supply to keep prices high. Oil needy to oil rich, 1970s. Inflation continued after the end of the embargo. This combined with economic downturn and unemployment. The stagnation of the 1970s jeopardized the well-being of most social groups. The young found it harder to establish independent households and to buy homes. More and more families found it hard to maintain their standard of living on one income, and poverty increased. The economic consequences of higher energy prices were more severe in poor regions of the world. Iran's oil profits were the part of the mix of factors that led to the downfall of the Shah in 1979 and the coming to power of Ayatollah Khomeini. Japan was one of the nations that successfully rode out the oil shocks and stagflation of the 1970s. The Japanese investment in energy conservation became, because of its lack of energy resources, one factor that helped Japan to do this. Japanese oil imports actually declined by 25% between 1973 and 1987, as the economy doubled in size. In Japan, there was a close cooperation between the government and large corporations. Japan gained from its skill at marketing incremental improvements in technology. Japanese innovations in managing workers and materials also led to increased productivity. High rates of saving among Japanese workers made more investment capital available to businesses. The Soviet Union. 50 years of Soviet agricultural policies had turned a food exporting nation into the world's largest importer. Problems were many, beginning with the collectivization effort in the early 1930s. Collectivization is the theory and practice of the ownership of land and means of production by the people or the state. A fifth of the Soviet harvest never reached market. Factory-produced goods, for example, according to rigid production quotas that bore no relation to the actual demand. The system recognized quantity but neglected quality. Leonid Brezhnev and others in the Soviet leadership showed little interest in changing the way the economy worked. China. People could remember a time before communist rule. They also remember the phantom associated with the Great Leap Forward and the social chaos of the Cultural Revolution. By the 1970s, it was impossible to ignore the gap between China and its traditional rival, Japan. Mao's last years. The Gang of Four was a group of 4 influential Chinese Communist Party figures, including Mao's third wife, Jinping. China's Cultural Revolution. Chairman Mao Zedong wished to renew the spirit of communist revolution and root out those he considered to be the middle-class infiltrators. Mao did not like colleagues who were advocating a path towards economic recovery that differed from Mao's vision, including Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping dedicated to the privacy of Chinese Communist Party, but he also wanted to enlarge China's influence and prosperity. Growth would come by offering incentives and allowing the market to operate freely. Deng provided official protection and encouragement to emerging entrepreneurs. While the system had some problems, it produced amazing economic growth.